I never thought a canceled flight and a 3-hour drive through a rain-slicked mountain pass would be the thing that saved my life in Oppos. As savings, but looking back at that gray Friday in October, I realized that gut feelings are usually just your subconscious picking up on ghosts before you even see them. My name's Elias Thorne. I teach American history at a community college 3 hours south of the Blackwood Range. And for the last 40 years, my family has owned a sturdy, hand-hewn cedar cabin tucked away on the quietest finger of Silver Lake. It's the kind of place where the air smells like wet pine and wood smoke, a place where you go to forget that the rest of the world is screaming. But as I turned my old Ford onto that gravel driveway and saw the glint of a strange, high-end SUV parked right where my truck should be, that peace vanished like a match in a hurricane. There's a sticker on the rear window of that silver Lexus that made my blood run cold. It read Highland Premier Rentals, and considering I've never once listed my sanctuary for a single soul to stay in, I knew right then that the quiet life I'd been living was about to get real loud, real fast. I didn't in Oppos. T-honk, didn't in Oppos. T-make a scene. I just cut the engine and let the truck coast to a stop, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird as I stepped out into the damp air. The cabin looked the same from the outside, but as I walked up the porch steps, I noticed small things that weren't in Oppos. T-mine, a new welcome mat with a generic in quote, stay a while in quote, script, a digital lockbox hanging from the doorknob, and the faint, unmistakable scent of expensive cleaning products drifting through the screen. I pulled my spare key from the hidden magnetic box under the railing, slid it into the deadbolt, and pushed the door open to find my living room looking like a stage set from a lifestyle magazine. My grandfather's old wool blankets have been replaced by white, sterilized duvets. There were, in quote, welcome guest, in quote, baskets on the cedar table I built with my own hands, and right there on the kitchen island sat a stack of glossy brochures titled The Silver Lake Collection, Your Exclusive Escape. I was standing in my own home feeling like a ghost, looking at my own fireplace on the cover of a magazine I never authorized, and that's when I heard the voice from the back deck, that sharp, nasal, in quote, I speak to the manager, in quote, tone that belonged to only one person in this zip code, in quote. The master suite is just through here, and as I mentioned, we in Oppos, upgraded the linens to 800 thread count, so you can really charge that premium weekend rate, in quote. The voice chirped, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on my floorboards. I turned around just as Brenda Vance, the president of the Blackwood Homeowners Association, rounded the corner with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a pair of potential, in quote, investors, in quote, in tow. Brenda was the kind of woman who wore cashmere sweaters in 60-degree weather just to show she could afford them. A woman whose blonde bob was so stiffly sprayed it could probably deflect small-caliber rounds. And the moment her eyes met mine, her face went from professional, in quote, realtor chic, in quote, to a shade of chalky gray I've only ever seen in history books. In quote, Elias, in quote, she stammered, her voice dropping an octave as she clutched that clipboard to her chest like a shield, in quote. You aren't in Oppos. T's supposed to be here. The schedule said you were at the Pedagogical Summit in Portland until Monday, in quote. I just stood there for a second, looking at her, then at the strangers in my house, then back at the woman who had been my neighbor for 15 years, and I felt a laugh bubbling up that wasn't in Oppos. T funny at all, in quote. The summit got canceled, Brenda, but I and Oppos am more curious about when my private residence became part of your Oppos collection in Oppos, because I dawned into Oppos. T remember signing a deed over to the HOA, or to you, in quote, I said, my voice low and vibrating with the type of anger I didn't in Oppos. T know I possessed. She tried to puff out her chest, tried to regain that, in quote, authority figure, in quote. Stance she used at the board meetings to fine people for having the wrong shade of mulch, and she had the audacity to tell me that the community was, in quote, struggling with infrastructure costs, in quote, and that since I was an absentee owner for most of the semester, it was only, in quote, fiscally responsible, in quote, to utilize the asset for the greater good, in quote. It's called trespassing, Brenda, and it's called grand larceny when you're literally selling nights in a bed you don in Oppos. Tion, in quote. I told her, stepping forward until the two investors looked at each other and started backing toward the door, realizing they'd walked into a legal minefield. Brenda's eyes darted around, looking for an exit, looking for a lie big enough to cover the hole she'd dug. And when she realized I was already pulling out my phone to record the brochures and the strangers, she did the most Brenda thing imaginable. She grabbed her own phone and dialed 911. End quote. Yes, I'd like to report a trespassing and a domestic disturbance at 412 Silver Lake Drive. End quote. She said into the receiver, her voice suddenly trembling with a fake, practiced fear. End quote. The owner has arrived in an erratic state. He's being aggressive, and I dawn into oppos. T feels safe. Please send a deputy immediately. End quote. I just watched her stunned by the sheer, unadulterated gall of it, as she stood in my kitchen, in my house, calling the cops on me for being in my own living room. The 20 minutes it took for the sheriff to arrive felt like a decade, with Brenda standing on one side of the island, pretending to be a victim, and me standing on the other, just watching the clock and wondering how deep this rot actually went. When Deputy Miller finally pulled up, he didn't end oppos. TC, an aggressive madman. He saw a tired teacher holding a stack of illegal brochures and a woman who couldn't end oppos. T stopped shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that her house of cards was caught in a high wind. I showed Miller my ID, the deed on my phone, and then I showed him the brochures with Brenda's personal LLC listed as the booking agent, and the look on that deputy's face told me everything I needed to know. End quote. Mon oppos. End quote. He said, turning to Brenda as she tried to explain that the end quote. HOA bylaws allowed for emergency property management, end quote. A phrase she'd clearly made up on the spot, end quote. There is no bylaw in the state of Idaho that allows you to rent out another man's house for profit while he's at work, so I'm going to need you to step outside and keep your hands where I can see them. End quote. But that was just the spark, the tiny little ember that started a fire that would eventually burn down half the town's power structure. Because as Brenda was being led to the cruiser, I started digging through the end quote. Welcome folders end quote she'd left behind. Underneath the glossy photos of my cabin, I found a spreadsheet, a master list, and my heart stopped when I saw that I wasn't in oppos. T the only one. There were 6 other properties listed, all belonging to, end quote, seasonal residents, end quote, elderly folks who spent winters in Arizona, or families who only came up for July, and every single one of them was being cycled through Brenda's rental LLC. I spent the next 48 hours on the phone with every neighbor I could reach, and the stories that came pouring out were like something out of a noir novel. Fines that didn't in oppos. T exist, end quote. Special assessments, end quote, for lake dredging that never happened, and threats of foreclosure over unpaid dues that residents swore they'd mailed months ago. I met up with a guy named Silas, a retired auditor who lived 3 cabins down, and we sat on his porch with a box of pizza and a mountain of public records we'd pulled from the county site. End quote. Look at this, Elias, end quote, Silas said, pointing to a series of liens filed by the Blackwood HOA over the last 3 years, end quote. They aren't in oppos. T just finding people they're targeted. They wait until someone gets behind on a single payment. Then they slap on into oppos, legal fees and oppos, that are 10 times the original debt, and then they move to seize the property under A and oppos, safety and abandonment and oppos. Clause they slipped into the bylaws back in 2022, end quote. We realized that Brenda wasn't into oppos. T just running a rogue Airbnb. She was running a land theft ring, using the HOA's legal power to manufacture debts, seize homes, and then, end quote, manage, end quote, them through her own company, until she could sell them off to developers. The escalation hit a fever pitch when we discovered the, end quote, ghost ballots, end quote. See, for a big change like that 2022 bylaw amendment to pass, they needed a 75% quorum, and according to the records, they got it. But as Silas and I cross-referenced the names on those yes votes, we found 4 people who had been dead for at least a year before the vote took place, and another 10 who had moved out of the state entirely. Brenda and her hand-picked board members have been signing names for the dead and the departed, effectively giving themselves the power to rewrite the law of our land whenever they pleased. It was a criminal enterprise disguised as a neighborhood committee, and the sheer scale of the ego involved. To think they could just steal people's homes because they weren't in oppos, tee around to check the mail, it made me want to burn the whole system to the ground. By the time the formal investigation was launched by the district attorney's office, the, end quote, investors, end quote, I'd seen in my kitchen had flipped, admitting they'd been told the properties were, end quote, distressed assets, end quote, being liquidated by the county. Brenda's husband, a local contractor who had been getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in, end quote, maintenance fees, end quote, from the HOA treasury for work that was never done, was caught trying to cross the border into Canada with a briefcase full of cash and a hard drive that contained the entire, end quote, land grab, end quote, strategy. The day of the final board meeting before the sheriff's department officially stepped in to dissolve the committee, the community hall was packed, not with the usual 5 or 6 board retirees, but with every single person who lived in the range. I stood up in the front, looking at Brenda and the 3 board members who were sitting there with their lawyers, still trying to maintain that air of superiority, and I didn't into oppose. To give a speech about history or law. I just held up my grandfather's old wool blanket, the one Brenda had stuffed into a trash bag to make room for her, end quote, luxury linens, end quote, and I told them that a home ISN into oppose. Just an asset for a spreadsheet. It's the place where our memories live, and they were never invited. The fallout was spectacular. Brenda ended up taking a plea deal for 20 years to avoid the racketeering charges that would have kept her away for life. Her husband is doing a decade for money laundering, and the Blackwood HOA was officially disbanded and replaced by a simple neighborhood watch that has exactly 0 power to fine anyone for anything. My cabin is quiet again, the end quote. Exclusive escape, end quote. Brochures have been recycled into fire starters, and the only scent in the air is the natural musk of the woods and the lake. But every time I sit on my porch now, I look at the driveway and wonder, if I had an oppose, to come home early if I'd stayed at that conference and let that, end quote, guest, end quote, check in, would I even have a porch to sit on today? The scariest part, ISN and oppose, that they tried to steal my house. It's how many other, end quote, Brindis, end quote, are out there right now, clutching clipboards and looking at your front door as if it's a vault they just haven and oppose. Cracked yet. So, I have to ask you, how well do you actually know the people running your neighborhood? Have you checked your local bylaws lately? Or are you just assuming that the, end quote, authority, end quote, in your life is actually playing by the rules? I'm back to teaching history now, but I've learned that the most important lessons aren't and oppose. In the books, they're in the shadows of your own backyard. Drop a comment below if you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA, or if you think people like Brenda are just a product of a system that gives too much power to the wrong people. I want to know if I and oppose am the only one who had to fight a war just to sit in his own living room. Give this a share if you think homeowners deserve more protection, because trust me, you don and oppose. Do you want to find out the hard way that your, end quote, sanctuary, end quote, is someone else's side hustle?